I am Sydney, 24 years old, and a final year master's student in forensic accounting. Last night at our lavish family dinner, my father announced he was cutting off my tuition until I apologized to my golden child sister. I did not cry or beg. I looked him dead in the eye and said one single word: all right. By sunrise, my bedroom was packed. My sister turned pale, standing in the doorway, saying, "Please tell me you did not send it." My father stopped smiling and demanded to know what I sent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in your own family. Growing up in an affluent neighborhood in Atlanta, my family presented the perfect image of Black excellence. My parents, DeAndre and Vivica, built a massive real estate empire from the ground up. To the outside world, we were absolute royalty. But inside our sprawling mansion, the reality was entirely toxic. I was the dark sheep of the family. I was analytical, cold, and completely uninterested in playing the fake socialite games my parents valued so highly. That role belonged perfectly to my older sister Jasmine. At 27, Jasmine was the golden child and the director of communications for our family company. She was beautiful, obsessed with appearances, and constantly played the victim whenever someone challenged her. Her biggest prize was her husband Spencer. Spencer was a 30-year-old white man from an old money family that was secretly going bankrupt. My parents worshipped him. They saw his whiteness and his old family name as a trophy that elevated their own status in the elite circles. They made him the chief financial officer of their empire, completely blind to the fact that he was using his perfect son-in-law disguise to bleed them dry. The real breaking point happened last night during our extravagant Sunday dinner. The dining room was silent except for the clinking of silver against expensive china. My father DeAndre wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and stared at me with pure disdain. "I am officially cutting off your master degree tuition starting tomorrow morning, Sydney," he announced, his voice echoing heavily in the large room. "Unless you get on your knees and apologize to Jasmine and Spencer right now for your disgusting accusations." I sat perfectly still, looking at the perfectly roasted meal in front of me. Just 2 days ago, I had used my forensic accounting skills to look into the company ledgers. I found multiple hidden transfers moving hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore shell accounts. Spencer was embezzling from my parents. When I brought this undeniable evidence to them privately, Jasmine threw a massive tantrum. She cried and screamed that I was jealous of her perfect marriage and that I was trying to frame Spencer because I was a bitter and lonely student. Across the table, Jasmine sniffled dramatically, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. "She just wants to ruin my life, Daddy." Jasmine whined, her voice trembling with fake sorrow. "She cannot stand that Spencer loves me, and that we are so happy together. She is trying to tear this family apart." Spencer wrapped his arm around Jasmine, looking at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. "We forgive you, Sydney," Spencer said softly, dripping with fake sympathy. "We know you are under a lot of stress with your forensic studies, and sometimes people make up fantasies when they feel inadequate. We just want you to get professional help. We love you and we want you to heal." My mother Vivica slammed her wineglass down on the table, spilling some of the expensive red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. "You are an absolute disgrace to this family, Sydney." My mother snapped, her eyes narrowing with anger. "We gave you everything, and you repay us by trying to destroy your sister and her husband. You have always been stubborn and rebellious. If you do not apologize this instant, you will not see another penny from us, and you can figure out how to pay for that useless degree all by yourself." They all stared at me, waiting for the emotional breakdown. They fully expected me to panic. In their minds, cutting off my financial support was the ultimate weapon that would force my submission. They thought I would cry, beg for forgiveness, and fall back into my assigned role as the obedient scapegoat. They thought my entire future depended entirely on their money and their gracious approval. I looked at Spencer, who was hiding a highly arrogant smirk right behind his crystal water glass. I looked at Jasmine, who was peeking through her fingers to see if I was crying yet. Finally, I looked at my parents who willingly chose a parasitic son-in-law and a manipulative daughter over their own flesh and blood. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. I simply picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly into a square, and placed it gently on the table. I looked right into my father's eyes and spoke one single word. All right. The confusion on their faces was instant and deeply satisfying. My father blinked clearly, thrown off by my totally calm response. What do you mean, all right? He demanded, leaning forward in his heavy wooden chair. I mean all right, I replied, keeping my voice incredibly steady and cold. Keep your money to yourselves. I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back. I did not yell or try to explain the financial evidence again. They had made their blind choice, and now I was going to make mine. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room, leaving them sitting in stunned and uncomfortable silence. I went straight to my bedroom and opened my laptop. I locked my bedroom door and leaned against the cold wood, taking a slow, deep breath. There were no tears falling down my face, no frantic pacing around the room. I was long past the point of heartbreak with these people. Instead, my mind was a sharp laser focused entirely on the numbers and the digital trail of deception that Spencer thought he had hidden so cleverly. I walked over to my heavy oak desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed, illuminating my face in the dark room. I reached into the hidden compartment of my backpack and pulled out a small black flash drive. This was not just any standard piece of equipment. I had spent the last 2 years studying advanced cybersecurity protocols alongside my forensic accounting courses, precisely because I knew white-collar criminals always left digital fingerprints. And Spencer, despite his arrogant confidence, was remarkably sloppy. I plugged the drive into the side of my laptop and initiated a program I had coded myself, specifically designed to bypass the outdated firewall my parents insisted was top of the line for their home office network. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in the administrative backdoor access codes I had quietly secured months ago when I helped my father upgrade the servers. The progress bar flashed on the screen, connecting, establishing secure uplink, and finally bypassing security protocols. I took another deep breath as the main server directory appeared on my screen. This was the exact place where the real estate empire stored its darkest secrets. Spencer thought his little offshore shell companies were untraceable, but he fundamentally misunderstood how modern forensic accounting worked. Money never truly disappeared, it just changed shape. I navigated past the dummy ledgers, the clean, perfect books that Jasmine probably helped him forge to present to my father at their weekly meetings. I went straight for the hidden temporary files, the digital sandbox, where Spencer manipulated the numbers before finalizing them. There it was, a folder labeled simply Project Horizon. I clicked it open and my stomach turned slightly, even though I already knew what I would find. The sheer volume of the theft was staggering. Pages and pages of fabricated invoices sent to shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, all signed off by my sister. Jasmine was not just a naive wife, she was an active participant in bleeding our parents dry to fund her lavish lifestyle and save Spencer's failing family name. I hit download and watched as gigabytes of damning evidence began transferring to my flash drive. While the files copied, I pulled a large black duffel bag from under my bed. I did not bother packing the expensive designer clothes my mother had bought me, the ones she used as bargaining chips to force me into attending her fake society events. I packed only the essentials: my comfortable jeans, my plain sweaters, and the few pieces of jewelry I had bought with my own hard-earned money from my part-time jobs. I packed my textbooks, my research notes, and every single piece of electronic equipment I owned. The silence in the house was heavy, suffocating. I could hear the faint murmur of voices downstairs. Probably Jasmine still whining to my parents about how mean I was, and Spencer soothing her with his fake comforting tones. They were likely discussing how they would force me to crawl back to them in the morning begging for my tuition money. They had no idea that their entire empire was currently downloading into a piece of plastic the size of my thumb. The laptop chimed softly, a small ping indicating the transfer was complete. I ejected the flash drive, slipped it into my front pocket, and closed the laptop, sliding it into my backpack. I zipped up my duffel bag and stood in the middle of the pale blue room that had been my prison for 24 years. I looked around, feeling absolutely nothing. No nostalgia, no regret. Just a cold, hollow determination to survive and eventually to see justice served. I grabbed a piece of thick white stationery from my desk and a black pen. I wrote a single line, folded it neatly, and left it right in the center of the perfectly made bed. It was not an apology, and it certainly was not a plea for forgiveness. I checked the time on my phone. It was 3 in the morning. I had 3 hours before the house would wake up, before the maids would arrive, and the daily performance of black excellence would begin again. I sat in the dark armchair in the corner of the room, my bags at my feet, and simply waited. I did not sleep a wink. My mind was already calculating my next moves, mapping out the exact steps I would take to secure a new loan for my final semester, plotting how I would use this information when the time was right. I was not going to blow the whistle immediately. That would be too easy, too messy. If I handed the flash drive to the police now, my parents, with their immense wealth and influence, would probably just hire a team of elite lawyers to bury it and blame it all on a rogue employee, or even worse, try to pin it on me. No, I needed to wait. I needed to finish my degree, get my credentials, and position myself in a place of undeniable authority. I needed to let Spencer get so incredibly comfortable in his thievery that he would make a mistake so large not even my father's money could cover it up. The sky outside my window slowly turned from pitch black to a bruised purple, then to a soft gray. The sun was rising on my last day in this house. At exactly 6 in the morning, I heard the heavy footsteps coming down the hallway. The loud, aggressive click of high heels on the hardwood floor. It was Jasmine coming to demand her apology, to twist the knife a little deeper, while I was supposedly vulnerable and desperate. I stood up, grabbed my bags, and turned to face the door, just as the handle violently twisted open. The heavy oak door swung inward, hitting the wall with a loud, violent thud. Jasmine marched into my room wearing a flowing silk designer robe and holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee. A smug, arrogant smile was plastered across her perfectly made-up face. She was fully ready to deliver her morning insults and demand her pathetic apology while I was supposedly broken and desperate. But her cruel smile vanished instantly the moment she looked at me, standing there fully dressed with my duffel bag and heavy backpack. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, realizing that my closet doors were wide open and completely empty. The expensive designer dresses and formal shoes my mother had bought me for their fake society events were left hanging there untouched, but everything that truly belonged to me was gone. The bookshelves were cleared of my forensic accounting textbooks and binders. My desk was stripped bare of my computer and all my electronics. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" Jasmine demanded, her voice losing its usual fake sweetness and dropping into a harsh, demanding tone. "You are not leaving this house until you get on your hands and knees and apologize to my husband." She stepped further into the room and noticed the single folded piece of thick white stationery I had left sitting right in the middle of my perfectly made bed. She snatched it up, ripping it open to read the message. It was not an apology. It was a simple sentence stating that I refused to be a pawn in their fraudulent games any longer. Jasmine crumpled the paper in her fist, her face contorting with pure rage. I did not say a single word to her. I simply adjusted the thick strap of my heavy backpack on my shoulder, picked up my duffel bag, and walked right past her. I bumped her shoulder slightly on my way out, causing her to stumble back and spill a few drops of her expensive coffee onto her pristine silk robe. She gasped in absolute shock, screaming my name, and immediately following me down the grand sweeping staircase. Her loud, shrill voice echoed wildly through the massive marble foyer, waking up the rest of the silent house. "Mom, Dad, get out here right now!" Jasmine yelled, practically tripping over her long robe as she chased me towards the front door. Sydney is trying to run away like a coward. I ignored her screaming and pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors, stepping out into the cool, crisp morning air of Atlanta. The sun was just starting to peek over the perfectly manicured hedges of our sprawling estate, casting a bright golden light on the massive circular driveway. Sitting right in the middle of the driveway was the silver Porsche my father had bought me for my 21st birthday. It was a beautiful and expensive machine, but just like everything else in this toxic family, it was nothing more than a trap. It was a gilded cage designed to keep me financially dependent and socially compliant. By the time I reached the edge of the driveway, the massive front doors burst open again. My father DeAndre stepped out hastily, tying the belt of his dark velvet robe, his face completely dark with morning rage. My mother Vivica was right behind him alongside Spencer, who looked groggy but quickly put on his practiced mask of the concerned and caring husband. "What is the meaning of this utter foolishness?" my father barked, marching down the stone steps with heavy, aggressive strides. "You think you can just pack your bags and leave without facing the serious consequences of your actions. You are acting like a spoiled, ungrateful child." I stopped walking and slowly turned around to face the four of them standing together on the grand portico of their hollow empire. I reached deep into my jacket pocket and pulled out the heavy silver keychain that held the keys to the Porsche. I looked down at the keys, holding them up so they could all see, and then looked back up at my father. "I do not need your luxury cars. I do not need your tainted money, and I certainly do not need your toxic conditional love," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, carrying clearly in the quiet morning air. I tossed the keys casually over my shoulder. They clattered loudly against the cobblestone driveway, landing right next to the front tire of the expensive car. My father stopped dead in his tracks, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. "You step off this property today, and you are cut off forever," he threatened, pointing a shaking, angry finger directly at me. "I will personally make sure you cannot get a bank loan, a decent job, or a single favor in this entire city. You will be absolutely nothing without my name." I smiled for the first time since the disastrous dinner last night. It was a cold, calculating, and utterly fearless smile that made my mother take a nervous, sudden step back. "I am already something," I replied smoothly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "I am the only person in this entire family who actually understands how to read a balance sheet without lying to myself." I shifted my cold gaze away from my father and locked eyes directly with Spencer. The white golden boy stood there looking incredibly confused, but I could see the very faint beginnings of absolute panic settling deep behind his pale blue eyes. "Spencer," I said, raising my voice just enough so it would strike him like a physical blow, "make sure you double-check the Project Horizon ledgers today. It would be an absolute shame if those hidden offshore routing numbers in the Cayman Islands somehow found their way to the Federal Financial Security Bureau." Spencer's face instantly drained of all its color. He looked exactly as if he had just been struck by lightning. His jaw dropped open slightly, and he took a sudden involuntary step forward before freezing completely in place. "What did you just say?" Spencer choked out, his voice barely a weak whisper, but loud enough for me to hear the sheer terror hiding inside it. Jasmine looked at her husband in absolute confusion, trying desperately to understand why the color had completely vanished from his face and why his hands were suddenly shaking. "What is she talking about?" Spencer Jasmine asked, tugging hard on his sleeve. "What is Project Horizon, and why do you look like that?" Spencer could not even bring himself to look at his wife. His wide, terrified eyes were glued to me as he realized that the quiet, analytical sister he had openly mocked and underestimated had just completely unraveled his entire criminal enterprise in one single night. My father looked back and forth between me and his precious son-in-law, sensing the sudden drastic shift in power but completely unable to comprehend what was actually happening to his perfect world. I did not wait for them to figure it out. The black SUV I had ordered on the app pulled up smoothly to the end of the long driveway, its tires crunching softly on the gravel. I turned my back on my toxic family for the final time. I walked down the rest of the driveway, opened the heavy door of the SUV, and threw my bags onto the back seat. I climbed in, shutting the door firmly behind me, completely cutting off the sound of my father angrily yelling my name. As the car pulled away, I looked out the tinted window and watched the perfect, pristine facade of my family estate shrink in the distance. Spencer was already frantically pulling out his cell phone, his hands shaking violently as he desperately dialed a number. Jasmine was yelling at him for answers, and my parents were standing on the lawn completely paralyzed by the chaos that had just destroyed their perfect morning. I leaned back against the leather seat and pulled the small black flash drive out of my pocket. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the immense weight of the undeniable evidence I now possessed. The real war had not even started yet, but I already held the ultimate weapon to destroy them all. The ride to the cheap motel on the outskirts of Atlanta was quiet. I watched the sprawling mansions of my childhood neighborhood slowly fade into strip malls and rundown gas stations. When the driver finally pulled up to the curb, I reached into my bag to hand him my debit card. He swiped it on his phone reader and frowned. "It says declined," he muttered, looking at me through the rearview mirror. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I pulled out my backup credit card and handed it to him. Declined again. I ended up paying him with the $50 bill I had tucked inside my phone case for emergencies. I grabbed my heavy duffel bag and stood on the cracked pavement of the motel parking lot, staring down at my phone screen. I opened my banking app and watched the red error messages pop up one after another. Account frozen. Access denied. Please contact your branch manager. My parents, DeAndre and Vivica, had wasted absolutely no time. They did not just cut off my tuition payments, they called their personal wealth manager at the bank and completely locked me out of my own checking and savings accounts. They even froze the account where I deposited my own paychecks from my part-time forensic accounting internship. They were trying to starve me out, trying to force me to come crawling back home before lunchtime. But they severely underestimated my resilience. I walked into the motel lobby, paid for 3 nights in cash, and carried my bags into a dimly lit room that smelled faintly of bleach and stale smoke. I sat down on the edge of the stiff mattress and opened my laptop, connecting to the unsecured Wi-Fi network. The moment I logged in, my phone started vibrating endlessly on the nightstand. Notifications were flooding my screen like a digital avalanche. Missed calls from aunts, uncles, and cousins, text messages filled with disappointment and anger. I clicked on a notification that led me directly to the private Facebook group of our affluent Black church. Our church was the epicenter of elite social life in our community, and my family sat right at the very top of its hierarchy. Right at the top of the page was a live video Jasmine had posted just an hour ago. I clicked play and watched my sister put on the performance of a lifetime. She was sitting on the plush velvet sofa in our family living room, wearing a modest beige sweater and no makeup to look as vulnerable and heartbroken as possible. She stared into the camera with tears streaming down her face, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical precision. "Church family, I come to you today with a heavy and broken heart," Jasmine sobbed, wiping her eyes. "Please pray for my younger sister Sydney. She has lost her way. Last night she stole thousands of dollars in jewelry and cash from our parents and ran away. We tried to get her help for her mental instability, but she has turned to a dark path of lies and theft. We love her, and we just want her to come home before she ruins her life completely. Please keep our family in your prayers during this devastating time." I stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. The comments underneath the video were already in the hundreds. The church elders, the deacons, and all the wealthy socialites my parents rubbed elbows with were leaving paragraphs of support for Jasmine and complete condemnation for me. They called me a disgrace, a troubled child, and a thief who was breaking my poor parents' hearts. Jasmine knew exactly what she was doing. She was destroying my reputation in the one community that could have offered me shelter or support. She was making sure that if I tried to tell anyone the truth about Spencer's embezzlement, they would instantly dismiss me as a bitter, lying thief. It was a preemptive strike designed to completely isolate me and paint her as the tragic, suffering sister. I closed the browser tab, feeling a cold wave of pure anger wash over me. I was not going to cry over losing the respect of hypocrites, but the sheer cruelty of her lie was staggering. Before I could even process the full scope of Jasmine's smear campaign, another notification popped up on my laptop screen. It was an urgent email marked with high importance from the disciplinary board of my university. I opened it and read the harsh block of text. Dear Sydney, you are hereby summoned to an emergency disciplinary hearing tomorrow morning at 9. The university has received formal documentation from the chief financial officer of your family corporation alleging that you committed severe corporate espionage and data theft. Your enrollment and your position in the Forensic Accounting Master Program are suspended pending the results of this hearing. I leaned back against the cheap motel headboard and let out a harsh, dry laugh. Spencer! The cowardly white son-in-law who was stealing millions of dollars from my family had actually dared to accuse me of corporate espionage. He was using his powerful position as the chief financial officer and his status as a major donor to the university to pressure the dean into expelling me. He knew that if I lost my student status, I would lose my access to the forensic software labs and the faculty mentors who could help me analyze the massive data dump I had stolen. He was trying to destroy my future before I could destroy his present. The wolves were truly attacking from every single angle. My parents had cut off my money to starve me. Jasmine had destroyed my reputation to isolate me. And Spencer was trying to strip away my education to disarm me. They thought this coordinated assault would break me. They thought I would panic and surrender the flash drive in exchange for my life back. I looked at the small black piece of plastic sitting next to my laptop. They had no idea that their relentless cruelty had just completely erased any lingering hesitation I might have had. I spent the next 12 hours locked inside that dingy motel room, staring at my glowing screen until my eyes burned. I categorized every single offshore routing number, every fake invoice, and every forged signature Jasmine had authorized. I built a comprehensive digital map connecting Spencer's personal bank accounts directly to the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Spencer thought he could use the university dean as a weapon against me because my father had donated the new library wing. He assumed the academic board would instantly bow to the wealthy corporate donor and throw me out onto the street without a second thought. But Spencer did not understand that academic bureaucrats cared more about federal funding and institutional reputation than they did about local real estate money. By the time the sun began to rise over the cheap motel parking lot, I had printed out a 50-page dossier. I took a quick cold shower, put on my sharpest gray business suit, and tied my hair back into a tight professional bun. I looked at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. There was no trace of the quiet, obedient daughter my parents wanted. There was only a cold, precise investigator ready to tear down an empire. I grabbed my briefcase and walked out into the early morning light, ready to face the wolves. The campus of the university was practically empty when I arrived. The morning air was crisp and cold, biting at my face as I walked up the wide concrete steps of the main administration building. I tightened my grip on the handle of my leather briefcase. Inside this massive building, the academic elites thought they held my entire future in the palms of their hands. They thought I was just a desperate, helpless student caught stealing from her wealthy, influential family. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. I walked past the front receptionist, who gave me a look of pure pity and pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main conference room. The disciplinary board was already seated and waiting for me. There were 5 of them, arranged behind a long, polished mahogany table, like a panel of federal judges, ready to deliver a guilty verdict. Sitting right in the center was Dean Harris, a man who had practically built his entire academic career on kissing up to wealthy donors like my father. He adjusted his silver glasses and looked down at his printed papers, refusing to even make eye contact with me. "Sit down, Sydney," he commanded, pointing to a single wooden chair placed in the middle of the large room. I did not sit. I walked over to the chair, rested my hand calmly on the back of it, and stared directly at him. "We received a very disturbing formal complaint from the chief financial officer of your family enterprise." Dean Harris began, his voice dripping with rehearsed disappointment. The documentation provided by Spencer claims that you illegally accessed highly confidential corporate networks and downloaded proprietary financial data. This is an act of severe corporate espionage. Because your father is one of our most generous alumni, we wanted to handle this situation quietly. But the university cannot harbor criminals. Effective immediately, your enrollment in the Master of Forensic Accounting program is permanently terminated. You will clear out your locker and leave the campus by noon today. The other 4 board members nodded in solemn agreement. They looked at me, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. They fully expected the tears, the desperate begging, the frantic promises to return whatever I supposedly took. They thought I would drop to my knees and plead for my academic life, because without this degree I was just a college dropout with a frozen bank account and a completely ruined reputation. I stared at Dean Harris and let a slow, cold smile form on my face. I reached down, unlatched my leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick manila folder. I tossed it casually onto the polished mahogany table. It slid perfectly across the smooth wooden surface, stopping right in front of the dean. "I am not here to beg for my enrollment," I said, my voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. "And I am certainly not here to talk about my cowardly brother-in-law and his completely fabricated claims. I am here to talk about the University Alumni Endowment Fund." The room went completely still. Dean Harris frowned, looking at the folder, as if it were an explosive device. "What is this?" he demanded, trying desperately to maintain his authoritative tone. "Open it and find out," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. He hesitantly opened the cover. The top page was a detailed financial spreadsheet covered in highlighted routing numbers and off-book transactions. I watched his eyes scan the numbers, and I saw the exact moment his heart dropped into his stomach. When I was doing my forensic accounting internship last semester, I noticed some very strange discrepancies in the university financial records, I explained, walking slowly around the wooden chair. "Since my father is one of your biggest donors, I had a personal interest in seeing exactly where his money was going. Imagine my absolute surprise when I discovered that the millions of dollars meant for the new library wing were being quietly funneled into a private development firm owned by your brother Dean Harris. And it was not just my father's money. The alumni fund has been missing over $4 million over the past 3 years. The entire board is signing off on fake vendor invoices to cover the massive deficit. You are all embezzling from the university." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. One of the female board members let out a sharp gasp and quickly covered her mouth with her trembling hand. Dean Harris was completely pale, his hands shaking violently as he flipped through the 50 pages of undeniable forensic evidence. Every single fraudulent transaction, every hidden bank account, every forged signature from the board members sitting in this very room was documented, printed, and verified. "You are not going to expel me," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "In fact, you are going to do the exact opposite today. You are going to grant me a full academic scholarship covering my final semester in its entirety. You are going to approve my thesis without any question, and you are going to provide me with a glowing letter of recommendation upon graduation. Furthermore, you will immediately reply to Spencer and my father, informing them that after a thorough review of their allegations, you found absolutely no evidence of wrongdoing on my part, and you are closing the disciplinary case permanently. If you refuse, or if I even suspect that you are trying to retaliate against me, I will send this entire dossier to the Federal Department of Education and the Regional Bureau of Investigation." Dean Harris looked up at me, his face a mask of pure, absolute terror. The arrogant academic who had tried to destroy me just 5 minutes ago was now sweating profusely under his expensive suit. He looked at the other board members, who were all staring at the folder in sheer panic, silently nodding their heads in frantic agreement. They knew they were completely cornered. The forensic evidence was airtight. "We understand, Sydney." The dean choked out, his voice cracking heavily. "There is no need to escalate this matter to the federal authorities. We value you as a student, and we will immediately process your full scholarship. The allegations from your family will be dismissed today." I smiled warmly, picking up my empty briefcase. I knew you would see reason, I said politely. I turned around and walked out of the heavy oak doors, leaving the corrupt disciplinary board trembling in my wake. I stepped back out into the crisp morning air, feeling an incredible rush of pure adrenaline. Spencer had tried to use the university to destroy me, but he had inadvertently handed me the exact leverage I needed to secure my education for free. I walked down the campus steps, pulling out my phone to check the time. I was fully enrolled, fully funded, and armed with a dangerous skill set. They thought freezing my bank accounts would leave me starving. They thought running a smear campaign would leave me alone. But every trap they set I dismantled. I had 6 months left until graduation. 6 months to disappear into the shadows and let my family think they had won while I prepared to burn their entire empire to the ground. The next 6 months passed in an absolute blur of relentless focus and silent preparation. I did not speak to a single member of my family. They assumed I was living in poverty, completely destroyed by their coordinated attacks. They thought my silence meant I had finally accepted defeat. But in reality, my silence was the sound of a carefully constructed weapon being loaded. I spent every waking hour in the university library or the forensic labs. I pored over the encrypted data I had taken from the family server, mapping out every single fraudulent transaction Spencer had executed. I traced the millions of dollars flowing from my father's real estate empire into the offshore accounts controlled by my brother-in-law. I lived in that cheap, dingy motel for 2 whole months before finding a tiny studio apartment on the wrong side of the city. I worked a brutal night shift at a local diner to pay for my basic groceries while maintaining my perfect academic record during the day. The exhaustion was physically painful, but I welcomed it. The physical drain kept me from dwelling on the emotional betrayal. Every time I felt tired, I just remembered the arrogant smirk on my sister's face and the cold disdain in my parents' eyes. It was the perfect fuel to keep me moving forward. Graduation day arrived on a humid morning in May. The campus was filled with proud parents cheering for their children and holding expensive bouquets of flowers. The air was filled with laughter and the popping of champagne corks. I walked across the grand stage entirely alone. There was no one in the audience clapping for me. My parents, DeAndre and Vivica, were probably sitting in their luxurious mansion, hosting a lavish brunch for their wealthy church friends, completely unaware that the daughter they threw away was graduating at the very top of her class. When the university president handed me my diploma with highest honors, I felt an immense sense of absolute victory. Dean Harris was sitting on the stage, and he actively avoided looking at me, handing over my degree with trembling hands. I had survived their starvation tactics and their vicious smear campaigns. I walked off that stage, took off my graduation gown, and threw it in the trash. I did not celebrate. I went back to my tiny apartment, put on my best business suit, and prepared for my final federal interview. I had applied for a highly coveted position at the Federal Financial Security Bureau months ago. It was the premier federal agency responsible for dismantling massive white-collar criminal syndicates. The background checks had been intensely rigorous. I had to sit through 3 separate polygraph tests and disclose everything, including my current estrangement from my powerful family. I fully expected them to reject me based on my father's massive political connections in Atlanta. But my flawless academic record, my specialized thesis on corporate embezzlement, and my cold analytical demeanor caught the attention of the regional director. His name was Director Mitchell, a tough veteran investigator who cared only about results and despised the corrupt elite. He saw exactly what I was capable of, and he knew my unique background was a rare asset. Within 2 weeks of graduation, I was officially sworn in as a junior forensic investigator for the Bureau. I traded my cheap studio for a modest, secure apartment near the federal building. I bought 2 sharp navy blue business suits and fully embraced my new life as a federal agent. For the first few months, I worked quietly on low-level tax evasion cases. The older senior agents in the bullpen initially underestimated me because of my age and my quiet nature. But I quickly proved my worth by finding hidden offshore assets that senior agents had completely overlooked for years. I was an absolute machine processing massive amounts of financial data with zero emotional interference. My colleagues thought I was just incredibly ambitious, but they did not know I was simply sharpening my skills for the real war. I was patient because I knew my time would eventually come. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when Director Mitchell called me into his corner office. The federal building was quiet, and the room smelled of old coffee and wet wool. He was standing by the large window watching the heavy Atlanta traffic below. "Sit down, Sydney," he said without turning around. I sat in the firm leather chair across from his heavy metal desk, placing my hands neatly in my lap. He walked over and dropped a massive classified file directly in front of me. The thick manila folder hit the desk with a heavy thud. It was easily 3 inches thick and stamped with a bright red confidential seal. "We have been building a specialized task force for a major money laundering operation," he explained, leaning casually against the edge of his desk. "This syndicate has been washing tens of millions of dollars through commercial real estate developments and moving the clean cash into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. We highly suspect local political corruption is keeping them protected from local law enforcement." I looked down at the thick manila folder. My heart maintained its steady, slow rhythm, but a sharp thrill of pure anticipation coursed through my veins. "Open it," Mitchell commanded, his voice low and serious. I reached out and flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. Staring back at me on the very first page was a high-resolution surveillance photograph of my father DeAndre shaking hands with a known corrupt city councilman. Right below it was a massive structural diagram of my family real estate empire. There were detailed digital notes pointing directly to Spencer and his exact role as the chief financial officer. The Federal Bureau had been tracking the very same financial anomalies I had discovered on that dark morning in my childhood bedroom. They had pieces of the puzzle, but I had the master key sitting on a black flash drive locked in my apartment safe. I looked up at Director Mitchell, keeping my face completely blank and professional. "You know exactly who these people are," I said, my voice perfectly level. Mitchell nodded slowly, crossing his arms over his chest. "I know they are your immediate family," he replied, his sharp eyes locking directly onto mine. "And I also know from your federal background check that they completely cut you off 6 months ago. The disciplinary board at your university tried to expel you based on a fraudulent complaint from that exact man," he said, pointing a thick finger at the glossy photo of Spencer. "We intercepted the university communications during our preliminary sweep. We know you have an intimate and unprecedented understanding of how their internal financial structure operates. I need to know right now, Sydney, if you can separate your personal feelings from your federal duties. This is a massive operation. Can you help us take down your own parents?" I looked back down at the photograph of my father and the structural diagram that proudly included my sister Jasmine and her thieving, arrogant husband. There was absolutely no hesitation in my mind. I reached across the metal desk and pulled the massive classified file closer to me. "I do not have a family, Director Mitchell," I answered coldly. "I only have targets." Director Mitchell did not smile, but I could see a brief flash of deep respect in his dark eyes. He reached across the heavy desk and handed me the digital security clearance badge that gave me full, unrestricted access to the highest levels of the federal financial databases. "You have full authorization, Sydney," he said, his voice completely professional but carrying a heavy weight. "Tear it all down." I took the badge and walked straight back to my small cubicle, carrying the massive classified folder against my chest. The federal bullpen was buzzing with other veteran agents typing rapidly and talking quietly on their secure phones. But all of that chaotic background noise completely faded away into total silence. I was finally in my absolute element. I booted up my dual computer monitors and plugged in the secure encrypted flash drive that contained all the raw, unedited files I had stolen directly from my father's corporate servers 6 months ago. The federal agents had pieces of the puzzle, but they were looking at it strictly from the outside, trying desperately to peek through the heavy velvet curtains of my parents' wealth and their massive political influence in the city. I did not need to peek through the curtains because I already possessed the complete architectural blueprints of their darkest lies. I spent the next 3 days and 3 nights practically living inside my tiny cubicle. I drank endless cups of terrible bitter breakroom coffee and ate dry protein bars, while my tired eyes scanned thousands of lines of complex financial code. The phantom money was incredibly elusive and highly sophisticated. Spencer was admittedly sloppy on the local office servers because he assumed nobody in the family was smart enough to check his work, but he had clearly hired highly skilled offshore accountants to hide the final destinations of the stolen funds. He was using a classic money laundering layering technique. The dirty money started its journey right inside my father's legitimate real estate development firm in Atlanta. Spencer would create totally fake vendor invoices for massive commercial construction projects. He would authorize heavy payments for thousands of tons of raw steel and commercial concrete that never actually existed in the physical world. The money would quietly leave the main corporate operating accounts and flow immediately into a series of domestic shell companies legally registered in Delaware. From Delaware, the money was rapidly wired out into international holding companies based in the Cayman Islands. This was the exact blind spot where the Federal Bureau had lost the trail entirely. The Cayman banks were notoriously strict about absolute client confidentiality, and they hid cowardly behind thick layers of complex international privacy laws. But Spencer had made one massive fatal error. He was too arrogant. He assumed nobody in his foolish, newly wealthy black family would ever have the intellect or the technical ability to trace an encrypted digital wire transfer. He did not even bother to properly wipe the temporary routing cache on the internal server before I downloaded the entire network on that final night in my childhood bedroom. Using the highly advanced federal tracing software, I was able to match the exact down to the second timestamps from his deleted cache directly to the global SWIFT banking network. The thick walls of offshore secrecy completely shattered across my computer screens. I found exactly where the phantom money was finally going. The offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands were not holding the money to build a secret nest egg for Spencer and my sister Jasmine. The money was only resting in the islands for a few brief days before it was quietly wired right back into the United States. I pulled up the final destination routing numbers and stared at my glowing monitor in absolute disbelief. The money was flowing directly into a series of private family trusts registered in wealthy suburbs of Connecticut and Massachusetts. I ran a rapid federal background check on the primary beneficiaries of those massive trust accounts. The names popped up on my screen in bold black letters, one after another. It was the entire extended family of my cowardly brother-in-law. Spencer's parents, his uncles, and his older brothers were listed as the sole owners of every single account. I leaned back in my cheap office chair and let out a harsh, bitter laugh that made the senior federal agent in the next cubicle look over at me in total confusion. The absolute tragic irony of the entire situation was almost suffocating. My parents DeAndre and Vivica had spent their entire lives building their massive empire from the dirt of the South. They desperately craved the validation of the old money white elite. When Spencer came along with his prestigious last name, his tailored suits, and his exclusive country club pedigree, they practically fell to their knees in absolute worship. They gave him the keys to their entire kingdom and completely cast aside their own flesh and blood daughter just to keep him comfortable. They thought Spencer was elevating them to a higher social status. They thought he was their golden ticket into a hidden world of untouchable prestige. But the glowing federal database told a completely different and pathetic story. Spencer's prestigious old money family was secretly completely broke. They had squandered their generational wealth decades ago on terrible real estate investments, failed businesses, and lavish, luxurious lifestyles they could no longer actually afford. Their massive historical estates in New England were mortgaged to the absolute breaking point. They were drowning in millions of dollars of hidden toxic debt. Spencer did not marry my sister because he loved her. or because he genuinely respected my powerful family. He married into black wealth strictly because he needed a vulnerable, arrogant piggy bank. He was nothing more than a financial parasite wearing a nice suit. He was deliberately bleeding my father's company completely dry, stealing millions upon millions of dollars every single month just to bail out his own sinking ship and maintain the completely fake illusion of his family's racial and social superiority. I pulled up another spreadsheet cross-referencing the forged vendor invoices with the dates of the massive offshore wire transfers. I needed to see exactly how much my sister actually knew about the theft. I hacked into the deleted email archives from Jasmine's corporate communication account. What I found made my blood run completely cold with pure disgust. Jasmine knew the money was leaving the company, but she did not know it was going directly to his parents. Spencer had convinced my foolish, arrogant sister that they were building a massive secret offshore empire just for the two of them. He told her in highly manipulative emails that they were hiding the money from my father so they could eventually take over the entire company and forcefully push my parents out into an early retirement. Jasmine was willingly helping her husband steal from our parents because she was incredibly greedy and hungry for total control. She was betraying her own family for a secret fortune that did not even exist. Spencer was playing all of them for absolute fools. He was masterfully using my parents' deep desperation for high status and my sister's bottomless greed as the perfect weapons to completely destroy them. And they had handed him the blade completely willingly while smiling for the cameras. I started compiling every single wire transfer, every fake construction invoice, and every deleted manipulative email into a massive digital presentation. I was no longer just building a standard financial criminal case, I was building an absolute execution protocol. I printed out the final routing documents and arranged them perfectly in the classified folder. My family had sacrificed me on the altar of their fake perfect image. They threw me out into the cold so they could stay warm next to a man who was actively pouring gasoline on their house. I picked up the heavy folder and walked back toward Director Mitchell's office. The federal trap was fully set, and I finally had the absolute power to trigger it. I walked back into Director Mitchell's office and placed the heavy classified folder squarely on his metal desk. He opened it slowly, flipping through the pages of printed offshore routing numbers. His expression remained completely stoic, but the slight tightening of his jaw told me everything I needed to know. "You have the financial paper trail, Sydney," he said, looking up at me. "But a smart defense attorney could try to argue that Spencer acted entirely alone and simply forged your sister's signature on those vendor invoices. We need undeniable proof that Jasmine is a willing co-conspirator and not just a naive wife who trusted her husband too much. I need you to pull the corporate security footage and any internal audio recordings you can find." I nodded, turning on my heel and heading straight back to my secure terminal. Mitchell was right. I needed to nail Jasmine to the wall with her own voice and her own actions. Before I pulled the video feeds, I needed to map out the exact timeline of their internal communications. I accessed the archived corporate email server and bypassed Jasmine's personal encryption key. She used a simple password based on her own birth date, proving once again how incredibly arrogant and lazy she was. I downloaded hundreds of private emails between her and Spencer. These were not official company emails. They were using a hidden secure channel they thought I could never reach. I read through messages where Jasmine explicitly demanded higher payouts from the phantom construction accounts. In one email sent just 2 days before I was kicked out of the house, Jasmine wrote directly to Spencer, complaining that her monthly allowance was simply not enough. "We need to pull another $50,000 from the commercial roofing budget," she typed. "I have a gala next week and I refuse to wear the same designer dress twice. Just make up a fake contractor and wire the money today." Spencer replied within minutes, confirming the fraudulent transfer and praising her for being so clever. Reading those words made my skin crawl. She was literally treating her parents' life work like an endless personal ATM. I then hacked into the central camera network and began scrubbing through months of high-definition video footage from the main corporate office in downtown Atlanta. My father always bragged about having the most expensive state-of-the-art security system installed on every single floor of the building. He thought he was protecting his empire from outside threats, completely oblivious to the fact that the real thieves were sitting right inside his executive boardroom. I focused entirely on the corner office that belonged to my sister. Jasmine had demanded the largest office on the top floor purely for the status it brought her. I found a file time-stamped just 3 weeks before my parents kicked me out of the house. I clicked play and watched the silent video feed load on my screen. Jasmine was sitting behind her massive glass desk browsing designer clothing on her computer. Spencer walked into the room carrying a thick stack of manila folders. He locked the heavy wooden door behind him and walked over to her desk. I ran a secondary federal decryption program to isolate and enhance the audio feed from the hidden security microphone. The static cleared, and their voices filled my headset with crystal clarity. "Look at these numbers," Baby Spencer said, leaning over her desk and pointing to the documents. The concrete shipment for the new downtown plaza was entirely fabricated. "If you sign these authorization forms right now, we can move another $200,000 into the Delaware Shell account before your father even wakes up from his afternoon nap." I watched my sister closely. I expected to see a brief moment of hesitation, or perhaps a flash of guilt on her perfectly contoured face. But there was absolutely nothing. Jasmine just laughed a cruel, high-pitched sound that made my stomach churn. She reached for her expensive gold pen and began signing the fraudulent documents one after another without even bothering to read the fine print. "Just make sure you transfer enough for my new Cartier bracelet, Spencer," she said casually, flipping to the next page. My mother was giving me a headache yesterday, complaining about how much money I spend on my personal stylist. When we finally drain this pathetic company dry and move to Europe, I am never speaking to her again. Spencer chuckled and kissed the top of her head. "Do not worry, sweetheart," he replied smoothly. "Your parents are entirely clueless. DeAndre is so desperate to show off his white son-in-law to his rich country club friends that he does not even look at the quarterly reports anymore. He practically hands me the keys to the vault every single morning." I sat in my dark federal cubicle, completely paralyzed by the sheer malice in her voice. Jasmine was not just a greedy participant, she was actively mocking the very parents who worshipped the ground she walked on. They had given her everything. They had completely destroyed my life just to protect her fragile feelings, and here she was laughing about leaving them completely bankrupt. I kept scrubbing through the footage, finding incident after incident of their disgusting complicity. I watched them drink expensive champagne in the office while forging tax documents. I listened to audio files where Jasmine explicitly instructed Spencer to pull money directly from the lower-level employee pension funds, just so she could buy a custom designer handbag for a charity event. The ultimate betrayal was not just the money, it was the absolute lack of basic human decency. My parents were incredibly flawed and toxic people, but they had worked themselves to the bone for decades to build a legacy for their children. Jasmine was trading that entire legacy away for a fake high-society lifestyle that was entirely built on lies. She was selling her own blood to a white man who openly mocked their black wealth behind closed doors. I opened a new secure folder on my federal server and began extracting every single video clip and audio file. I clipped the footage of Jasmine signing the fake invoices. I isolated the audio of her demanding money from the stolen pension funds. I created a master timeline that perfectly synced her verbal commands on the security footage directly with the massive offshore wire transfers, leaving the corporate accounts just minutes later. There was no longer any shadow of a doubt. Jasmine was just as guilty as Spencer, if not more so. She was the inside key that allowed the parasite to completely consume the host. I compiled the final multimedia presentation and locked it behind a federal encryption firewall. I had the financial ledgers. I had the deleted emails. I had the high-definition video of the actual crimes being committed. I took off my headset and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my tired eyes. The anger that had been burning inside me for the past 6 months slowly dissolved into a cold, absolute calculation. My family had always treated me like a criminal just for telling the truth. Now I was going to show them exactly what real criminals looked like. I was fully armed and entirely ready for the final act of this tragedy to begin. I needed to step away from the glowing screens of the federal database for just an hour. My eyes were burning from staring at endless columns of routing numbers and offshore wire transfers. I decided to take my short lunch break and walk down to the high-end commercial district in downtown Atlanta. I was not looking for anything glamorous or expensive. I just needed to buy a simple pair of comfortable walking shoes for the long hours I spent standing by the forensic servers, analyzing the financial ruin of my own family. I walked into a large, brightly lit department store that anchored the luxury mall. I was wearing my standard federal uniform, which consisted of a plain navy blue suit, a crisp white button-down shirt, and my security badge tucked away safely in my inner pocket. I looked like an average working professional, completely invisible to the wealthy socialites who treated this shopping center like their own personal runway. I was browsing the practical footwear section when I heard the familiar shrill sound of my sister's forced laughter echoing across the marble floor. I froze instantly, my body tensing up before my logical brain could take over. I slowly turned my head and looked through the glass displays, separating the quiet shoe department from the high-end designer boutiques in the main corridor. There they were. My mother Vivica and my sister Jasmine were walking out of an exclusive jewelry store, carrying multiple glossy shopping bags swinging from their arms. They were dressed in immaculate designer outfits dripping in expensive fabrics and looking down their noses at anyone who dared to walk too close to them. I wanted to just turn around and walk away to avoid the completely unnecessary confrontation, but part of me, the cold, analytical federal agent, wanted to see exactly how arrogant they had become using the stolen money I was tracking. I stepped out from behind the glass display case and walked directly into their path, blocking their way. It took my mother a few seconds to even recognize me standing there. When she finally did, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up in absolute shock, and her mouth twisted into a highly familiar sneer of deep disgust. "Well, look exactly who it is," Vivica announced loudly, her voice cutting sharply through the soft background music of the mall. "The runaway daughter has finally decided to show her face in public after completely abandoning her family." Jasmine stopped dead in her tracks, shifting her heavy designer bags to one arm so she could place her other hand firmly on her hip. She looked me up and down, taking in my plain navy suit and my scuffed practical shoes with a look of pure unfiltered pity and malice. Sydney Jasmine sighed dramatically, shaking her head so her perfect expensive hair bounced around her shoulders. "You look absolutely terrible today. Are you still living in a cheap, dirty motel and buying your clothes from discount bins just to survive? If you had just swallowed your stupid, stubborn pride and apologized to Spencer, you would not be walking around looking like a low-level bank teller, begging for extra hours. We could have taken you shopping today and bought you something decent, but you chose to be bitter and poor instead." I stood there perfectly calm, feeling absolutely no anger or shame at her cruel words. They had no idea that the cheap suit I was wearing was a federal uniform, or that I held the absolute power to freeze every single credit card in their expensive leather wallets with a single simple phone call to Director Mitchell. "I am doing just fine," I replied, keeping my voice completely level and devoid of any emotional reaction. "I actually enjoy earning an honest living doing real work." My mother let out a harsh, mocking laugh that made a few nearby shoppers turn their heads. "An honest living," Vivica repeated, rolling her dark eyes in pure contempt. "You always were so self-righteous and incredibly boring, Sydney. Look at your sister right now. Look at what a real successful marriage and true family loyalty actually brings." She grabbed Jasmine's hand and aggressively thrust it forward right into my face. Sitting prominently on Jasmine's ring finger was a massive, flawless diamond ring. It was enormous, easily 5 carats, catching the bright overhead mall lights and scattering sharp, bright rainbows across the polished marble floor. "Spencer surprised me with it this very morning." Jasmine bragged, her voice dripping with extreme arrogance. "It is an early anniversary upgrade. He is doing so incredibly well, managing the company finances since you selfishly left us." He just closed a massive development deal and decided to spoil me completely. I looked down at the massive glittering diamond ring. I did not see a romantic anniversary gift or a symbol of financial success. I saw the fraudulent commercial roofing invoices I had just decrypted an hour ago. I saw the stolen employee pension funds that honest working people relied on. I saw a piece of compressed carbon purchased entirely with dirty money that was going to send my arrogant brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. "It is a very beautiful ring, Jasmine," I said, maintaining direct eye contact with her and offering a totally flat, lifeless smile. "The stone is incredibly clear and the cut is perfect. It must have cost an absolute fortune to acquire." Jasmine puffed out her chest, looking incredibly smug and victorious, thinking she had finally made me admit defeat. "Spencer only buys the absolute best for me," she declared proudly, tossing her hair back. I tilted my head slightly, taking a small, deliberate step closer to her, invading her personal space. My voice dropped to a low, intimate conversational whisper that only she and my angry mother could possibly hear over the mall noise. "It really is stunning," I murmured softly, my eyes locking onto hers. "Is the diamond sourced locally, or did Spencer have to use one of his Swiss bank accounts to pay for it? I hear the international wire transfer fees from Delaware to the Cayman Islands and then over to Switzerland can be quite expensive these days, especially when you are secretly pulling all the funds directly from the downtown plaza commercial concrete budget to pay for your jewelry." The effect was absolutely instantaneous and incredibly violent. All the blood completely drained from Jasmine's perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking like a pale, sickly ghost. Her mouth opened in shock, but no sound came out of her throat. The muscles in her arms went entirely slack in pure, unadulterated terror. The heavy, glossy designer shopping bag slipped right out of her trembling fingers and crashed loudly onto the hard marble floor. A delicate glass perfume bottle inside one of the bags shattered instantly on impact, sending the strong, overwhelming scent of expensive floral perfume spilling violently across the shiny white tiles. "Jasmine, what on earth is wrong with you, my mother?" Vivica snapped, looking down at the massive mess on the floor in total annoyance. "You just broke a $600 bottle of perfume right in the middle of the mall." But Jasmine could not even hear our mother shouting at her. Her wide, terrified eyes were completely locked onto mine. She was staring at me as if I had just morphed into a terrifying monster right in front of her. Her breathing became shallow and extremely frantic, her chest heaving under her designer blouse. The smug, arrogant sister who was just bragging about her stolen wealth was suddenly hyperventilating in the middle of a crowded luxury mall. She finally realized in that exact moment that the quiet scapegoat sister she had so cruelly cast out into the street somehow knew every single intimate detail of her most highly guarded criminal secrets. How Jasmine choked out her voice, barely a rough scratching whisper. "How do you know about that?" I did not answer her desperate question. I just stood there silently, letting the heavy, suffocating silence wrap completely around her terrified mind like a dark, heavy blanket. I looked down at the puddle of expensive perfume spreading rapidly across the floor, and then looked back up at her pale, trembling face. "You should really be much more careful with your expensive things, Jasmine," I said, my voice ice-cold and completely steady. "You never know when they might just suddenly disappear completely." I turned my back on them, without waiting for another single word from my highly confused mother. I walked calmly down the wide luxury mall corridor, heading straight back toward the secure federal building. I did not look back even once, but I could hear my mother loudly demanding an explanation and Jasmine frantically crying while trying to gather her broken bags. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. As soon as she got out of that mall, Jasmine was going to make a completely panicked, desperate phone call to Spencer, and the true rapid unraveling of their fragile criminal empire was finally going to begin. I returned to my secure terminal at the federal building and logged back into the financial databases, but across town, a completely different kind of reckoning was just beginning to unfold. Spencer was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk in the corner office of my father's real estate firm. He was nursing a glass of expensive scotch, trying desperately to calm his violently shaking hands. Just 20 minutes before I encountered my sister at the luxury mall, a completely unremarkable man, wearing a cheap gray suit, had walked right past the corporate security desk and stepped directly into Spencer's office. The man simply dropped a thick, sealed envelope onto the polished wood surface, stated that Spencer was officially served, and walked out without another single word. Spencer had stared at the heavy envelope for 5 full minutes before finding the courage to tear it open. Inside was a formal federal subpoena issued directly by the Federal Financial Security Bureau. It was demanding the immediate surrender of all banking records, ledgers, and wire transfer receipts connected to 3 specific Delaware shell companies. They were the exact same shell companies Spencer used to wash the stolen construction funds. The pristine white pages felt heavier than concrete in his trembling hands. The feds did not just suspect financial anomalies, they knew the exact routing numbers and the precise dates of the massive offshore transfers. Spencer felt all the blood drain from his head, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. He reached for his scotch, but his phone suddenly started buzzing aggressively. The caller ID flashed Jasmine's name. He answered it hoping for a brief distraction, but was immediately met with the sound of his wife completely hyperventilating. "Spencer, you need to listen to me right now." Jasmine screamed into the phone, her voice totally unrecognizable and frantic. "I just saw Sydney at the mall. She looked terrible, but she said something to me, Spencer. She knew about the money. She looked right at my new diamond ring and asked if you used a Swiss bank account to pay for it. She knew the money was going from Delaware to the Cayman Islands. She knows everything, Spencer." Spencer dropped his crystal glass. It hit the edge of the mahogany desk and shattered into a dozen pieces, spilling premium scotch all over the expensive rug. But he did not even notice. The heavy federal subpoena sitting right in front of him suddenly made terrifying, perfect sense. The Federal Bureau was not conducting a random audit. They were being fed highly classified internal information by an expert who knew exactly where to look. Spencer closed his eyes as a wave of absolute dread washed over his entire body. He finally remembered the night Sydney was kicked out of the house. He remembered her calm demeanor and the way she smiled at him in the driveway. She did not just pack her clothes that night. She had bypassed his lazy security protocols and downloaded the entire corporate server. The quiet, brilliant forensic accounting student he had openly mocked for years was now actively working with the federal government to completely destroy him. "We are going to federal prison," Spencer Jasmine sobbed through the phone, losing her carefully crafted high society composure. "My parents are going to find out, and they will kill me before the feds even get the chance to arrest us. We have to pack our bags and leave the country tonight." Spencer gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning completely white. "Shut up, Jasmine," he snapped, his voice harsh and desperate. "If we run right now, we just prove that we are guilty, and they will freeze every single account we have before our plane even leaves the runway in Atlanta. We cannot run. We have to handle this the exact same way your father handles all of his problems. We have to buy our way out." Jasmine sniffled loudly on the other end of the line, clearly confused by his sudden shift in tone. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How do you buy off the federal government, Spencer?" "I am not talking about buying off the feds," Spencer replied, his mind racing furiously as he formulated a dark, desperate plan. "I am talking about buying off your sister. You just said she looked terrible at the mall, right? She was wearing cheap clothes and ugly shoes. She is totally broke, Jasmine. Your parents completely cut off her tuition and froze her bank accounts 6 months ago. She might have the files and she might have tried to tip off the feds, but she is still just a desperate, hungry college dropout who needs cash. We just need to give her a massive payout to make all of this disappear entirely. We will offer her $500,000. We will tell her it is a peace offering from the family to help her start a new life. But in exchange, she has to sign a completely ironclad non-disclosure agreement and formally surrender all of her legal rights to the family estate. If she signs the contract, she can never legally testify against us or share those stolen files without going to prison." Jasmine went completely silent on the phone, absorbing his desperate logic. "Where are we going to get $500,000 without my father noticing?" she finally asked. Spencer let out a dark, bitter chuckle. "We will use your father's own money to pay her off," he explained, wiping the sweat from his pale forehead. "I will convince DeAndre that Sydney is threatening a massive public lawsuit that could completely ruin the 30-year anniversary of his precious company. He cares about his public image more than anything else in the world. He will gladly authorize the payment just to keep her completely silent and far away from his perfect life. We are having the massive company gala this weekend. It is the perfect setup. We will invite her to the party, pull her into the private VIP room with our corporate lawyers and trap her. We will flash a massive check right in her face and she will be too desperate and too poor to say no. Once she signs that paper, we are completely safe and we can finish draining the company before we leave for good." It was a plan born out of pure, unadulterated arrogance and blind desperation. Spencer fundamentally believed that every single person in the world was just as greedy and morally bankrupt as he was. He completely underestimated the cold, calculated wrath of a daughter who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He thought a piece of paper and a stolen check could silence the storm that was rapidly approaching his doorstep. He hung up the phone with his trembling wife and immediately started drafting the fraudulent legal documents that he foolishly believed would save his pathetic life. He had absolutely no idea that I was already sitting in a secure federal building, tracking his every single digital move and patiently waiting for him to walk right into the exact trap he thought he was setting for me. It was only 2 days after the mall encounter when the heavy black envelope arrived at my secure apartment building. The concierge handed it to me as I was coming back from a long shift at the Federal Bureau. It was made of thick, expensive cardstock, with the gold-embossed logo of my father's real estate empire pressed right into the center. I did not even need to open it to know exactly what was inside. I rode the elevator up to my floor, turning the envelope over in my hands. The sudden, desperate attempt to contact me after 6 months of absolute silence was completely expected. I walked into my apartment, dropped my keys on the counter, and sliced the thick paper open. Inside was a VIP invitation to the 30-year anniversary gala for the company. Along with the invitation was a single-typed letter from my father DeAndre, requesting my mandatory presence in a private meeting room at the hotel 1 hour before the main event started. I sat down on my sofa and logged into my secure federal laptop to check the digital surveillance traps I had placed on the corporate network. I already knew what they were planning, but I wanted to see exactly how Spencer had manipulated my father into agreeing to it. I pulled up the audio files from the executive boardroom recorded just yesterday morning. The crystal-clear audio filled my quiet apartment. I listened as Spencer walked into my father's office, playing the role of the deeply concerned and highly stressed son-in-law. He fed DeAndre a completely fabricated story about how I was supposedly planning to crash the anniversary gala with a team of sleazy lawyers to file a massive public lawsuit for emotional damages and unpaid wages. Spencer knew exactly which buttons to push. He knew my father cared about his flawless public image and his standing in the affluent Black community more than anything else in the entire world. DeAndre reacted exactly the way Spencer predicted. The audio recording captured my father slamming his fist down on his heavy wooden desk in pure anger. He refused to let his 30-year legacy be ruined by a bitter, disgraced daughter in front of the mayor and all the wealthy investors. Spencer then smoothly introduced his devious solution. He suggested they offer me a massive financial settlement to completely sever my ties to the family forever. $500,000, Spencer had said, his voice dripping with fake concern. We give her a check for $500,000, but only if she signs an airtight non-disclosure agreement and formally signs away all of her future inheritance rights. She is broke and desperate, DeAndre. She will take the money and disappear, and your gala will go off without a single problem. My father had agreed immediately, authorizing the massive withdrawal from the corporate operating accounts without even checking the balance. I read through the specific clauses of the legal contract they had emailed me shortly after that meeting. The cruelty woven into the legal jargon was genuinely breathtaking. The non-disclosure agreement demanded that I never speak about the internal finances of the company to any law enforcement agency, media outlet, or private individual for the rest of my natural life. It included a massive penalty clause stating that if I ever broke my silence, I would owe the company $5 million in immediate damages. Furthermore, the inheritance waiver was entirely absolute. By signing the document, I would be legally completely erased from the family tree. I would have no claim to any properties, trusts, or liquid assets upon the death of either DeAndre or Vivica. They were paying $500,000 to legally pretend I had never even been born. Reading those cold legal words was the final necessary closure I needed. Any tiny lingering shred of hope that my father truly loved me was completely extinguished by his willingness to sign that document. DeAndre was perfectly willing to erase his own daughter from existence just to protect his public image and keep his golden child happy. He did not care about the truth or the incredibly obvious warning signs I had tried to show him 6 months ago. He only cared about the glittering facade of black excellence he had constructed for his country club friends. He was choosing the parasite over his own blood, and he was doing it with total, absolute conviction. I stopped the audio recording and let out a cold, quiet laugh. Spencer was incredibly predictable. He was using $500,000 of stolen company money to try and bribe a federal agent into silence. He thought the non-disclosure agreement would act as an impenetrable shield against any future criminal charges. I had already forwarded all of those drafted documents directly to Director Mitchell. The federal prosecutors were absolutely thrilled. Spencer was not just committing wire fraud and money laundering anymore. By trying to force me into signing a contract to cover up his financial crimes, he had just officially added witness tampering and corporate bribery to his rapidly growing list of federal offenses. He was practically building his own prison cell brick by brick. I looked back down at the elegant gold embossed invitation resting on my coffee table. The gala was scheduled for this coming Saturday night at the most expensive luxury hotel in downtown Atlanta. It was going to be a massive, highly publicized event filled with local politicians, wealthy church leaders, and elite socialites. My parents were planning to stand on a grand stage and accept awards for their business excellence, while secretly bleeding out from the inside. And in the shadows of that glittering ballroom, they were planning to corner me and force me to sell my soul for a fraudulent check. They truly believed I would walk into that private room as a broken, desperate victim, ready to accept their cruel terms just to survive. I stood up and walked into my bedroom, opening the door to my small closet. I was not going to wear the cheap navy suit I wore to the federal building, or the practical shoes my mother had openly mocked at the mall. If I was going to walk into the lion's den, I was going to do it wearing absolute armor. I pulled out a sleek, tailored black evening gown that I had purchased specifically for this exact night. It was sharp, elegant, and completely devoid of any softness or vulnerability. I paired it with a pair of high stiletto heels that would echo loudly on the marble floors of the luxury hotel. I was going to look exactly like the powerful forensic investigator I was. I spent the rest of the week finalizing the massive criminal dossier. Every single page was printed, indexed, and sealed inside a thick black leather portfolio. The arrest warrants for Spencer were officially signed by a federal judge on Friday afternoon. The asset freeze orders were completely finalized and ready to be executed by the federal banking authorities the very second I gave the signal. The trap was entirely set, and Spencer was standing right in the center of it, holding a fake check and a worthless contract. I packed the heavy leather portfolio into my sleek black briefcase. The 30-year anniversary of my father's empire was definitely going to be an unforgettable night, but not for the reasons he was hoping for. The toxic family that had cast me out into the cold was about to experience a complete and absolute destruction, and I was going to have a front row seat to watch it all burn. Saturday night arrived with a heavy, humid breeze sweeping through downtown Atlanta. I pulled my car up to the valet stand of the Grand Regency Hotel. The entire block was sectioned off with velvet ropes and bright flashing camera lights. This was the absolute pinnacle of Black elite society in the city. Wealthy investors, powerful politicians, and megachurch pastors walked down a literal red carpet. Women wore sparkling designer gowns, and men wore custom-tailored tuxedos. They were all here to celebrate the 30-year anniversary of a real estate empire that was secretly hollow and bleeding out. I stepped out of my car, handing my keys to the valet. I smoothed down the fabric of my sharp black evening gown. It fit me like a perfect suit of armor, completely devoid of any softness or vulnerability. I grabbed my sleek black briefcase holding the heavy leather portfolio and walked toward the massive glass doors. I did not look like the desperate, hungry dropout they were expecting. I looked like a federal executioner walking into a room full of condemned prisoners. Every detail of this event was designed to project an image of untouchable financial stability and generational wealth. It was a beautifully constructed illusion, built entirely on a foundation of massive federal fraud. I stepped inside the grand ballroom, and the sheer opulence was almost suffocating. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high-painted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the massive ice sculptures and endless towers of expensive champagne. The room was buzzing with loud laughter and the smooth sounds of a live jazz band playing in the corner. I walked slowly down the grand staircase, my stiletto heels clicking sharply against the polished marble steps. Heads began to turn almost immediately. I had been completely erased from the family narrative for the past 6 months. Most of these wealthy socialites had seen Jasmine's crying video on Facebook, claiming I was a mentally unstable thief who ran away in the middle of the night. Now they stared at me in total shock. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a sudden cold wind. People lowered their champagne flutes, leaning in close to each other, completely scandalized by my sudden reappearance. I kept my head held high, ignoring their judging eyes. They were all just foolish extras in a play that was about to end in total tragedy. I scanned the massive crowded room, patiently looking for my targets. I spotted them standing near the front of the stage, holding court with the city mayor and a group of wealthy corporate bankers. My father, DeAndre, wore a sharp black tuxedo, smiling broadly and shaking hands like a benevolent king. My mother, Vivica, stood right next to him, draped in heavy gold jewelry and a sparkling emerald dress. Jasmine and Spencer stood just a few feet away, looking like the picture of a perfect, successful young couple. When my mother finally saw me walking toward them, her fake practiced smile completely vanished. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, cold disdain. She tapped my father on the shoulder and pointed a stiff, trembling finger in my direction. DeAndre turned around, his eyes instantly darkening with intense anger. He quickly excused himself from the mayor, offering a fake apologetic laugh before he marched toward me, pulling Vivica alongside him. "What are you doing walking through the main ballroom?" Vivica hissed through clenched teeth, keeping her voice low so the nearby guests would not hear. "You are drawing completely unnecessary attention to yourself, Sydney. You were supposed to use the service elevator and wait quietly in the private room until we were ready for you." I just smiled, a cold, completely empty smile. "I wanted to see the beautiful decorations, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any actual emotion. "It looks like you spent a massive amount of stolen money to put all of this together tonight." My father stepped closer, his face turning a dark, angry red. "Keep your mouth shut and stop causing a scene," DeAndre ordered in a harsh, menacing whisper. "We are offering you a completely generous lifeline today, and you are acting like an arrogant, ungrateful child." Before I could respond, Spencer suddenly appeared beside my father, playing his carefully rehearsed role of the perfect peacemaker. He placed a gentle hand on my father's shoulder and offered me a sickeningly sweet smile. "DeAndre, please let me handle this," Spencer said, his voice dripping with fake compassion. "Sydney is just overwhelmed by the large crowd, and she is probably very tired from her difficult living situation. Let us all just calm down and move to the private suite so we can settle this family matter peacefully." Spencer looked at me silently, urging me to follow him, thinking he was expertly manipulating the broken outcast sister into taking a desperate bribe. Jasmine stood a few feet behind him, clutching her diamond necklace and looking at me with pure terrified anxiety. She was the only one who truly understood how dangerous I actually was. She remembered the incident at the luxury mall and knew I was fully aware of the Cayman Island accounts. Her eyes darted nervously down to the sleek black briefcase in my hand, and I saw her visibly swallow hard. She gently tugged on Spencer's sleeve, trying to get his attention, but he completely ignored her. He was too busy basking in his own fake heroism, playing the savior for my angry parents. I looked right at Spencer and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. "Lead the way, Spencer," I said, gripping the handle of my black briefcase tightly. "I am completely ready to sign exactly what you have prepared for me tonight." Spencer beamed with total arrogant satisfaction and gestured toward the heavily guarded hallway that led to the executive suites. My parents turned around and marched ahead of us, refusing to look at me again. I followed closely behind them, feeling the heavy weight of the federal warrants resting securely inside my briefcase. The tension in the air was completely palpable, but they had absolutely no idea they were walking themselves directly into an inescapable federal cage. We walked down a long, quiet corridor lined with expensive artwork and thick red carpet that completely swallowed the sound of our footsteps. Two massive security guards wearing dark suits stood outside a set of heavy wooden double doors at the very end of the hallway. They stepped aside and pulled the doors open as my father approached. I stepped into a massive private executive suite that smelled heavily of expensive cigars and old leather. The contrast between the loud, vibrant party outside and the dead silence of this room was incredibly sharp. Sitting around a large, polished mahogany conference table were three older men in dark gray tailored suits. They were my father's elite corporate lawyers, the men he paid thousands of dollars an hour to bury his mistakes and intimidate his rivals. They looked up at me with cold, calculating eyes, as if I were just a minor legal nuisance they were about to quickly squash into the ground. My father, DeAndre, walked straight to the head of the heavy wooden table and took a seat, pointing aggressively to a single empty chair directly across from him. "Sit down, Sydney," he ordered, his deep voice echoing harshly against the wood-paneled walls. My mother, Vivica, took the seat right next to him, crossing her arms tightly over her sparkling emerald dress and refusing to even look in my direction. Spencer and Jasmine stood near the heavy wooden doors, leaning casually against the wall, like prison guards, making sure I could not easily escape the room. I walked slowly over to the designated chair, but I absolutely refused to sit down. I placed my sleek black briefcase gently on the polished mahogany table and remained standing, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. One of the corporate lawyers, a balding man with thick silver glasses, slid a heavy stack of legal documents across the smooth table. The thick stack of papers stopped right in front of my black briefcase. The lawyer cleared his throat and tapped the top page heavily with his expensive gold pen. "This is a standard non-disclosure and severance agreement," he explained in a flat robotic voice that lacked any human emotion. "It completely terminates any and all of your legal rights to the family estate, the private trust funds, and all corporate holdings. It also binds you to absolute permanent silence regarding any internal family dynamics or private business matters. In exchange for your signature today, your father has generously agreed to provide a massive one-time settlement payment to help you start over." Spencer stepped forward slowly, reaching into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored tuxedo. He pulled out a crisp rectangular piece of paper and dropped it right on top of the thick legal documents. It was a certified corporate check made out directly to me for exactly $500,000. Spencer looked at me with a sickeningly arrogant smirk, his blue eyes flashing with total fake superiority. "Take the money," Sydney Spencer said softly, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "It is way more cash than you will ever see in your entire lifetime, working whatever low-level accounting job you managed to scrape together after you dropped out of the university." You can finally stop living in cheap, dirty motels and buy yourself a decent, normal life. Just sign the paper, and we can all move on from this highly unfortunate family drama once and for all." My father leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the polished table. He looked down at the massive check and then looked back up at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "You have always been a massive disappointment to this family." Sidney DeAndre spat out his words, dripping with pure venom and rage. "We gave you every single advantage in the world, and you squandered it all because you were too stubborn. You refused to play your proper part in this family, and you foolishly tried to ruin your sister and her husband out of pure, bitter jealousy. Look at Spencer right now. He is a truly brilliant financial mind who has doubled our commercial development profits in just 3 years. He is the son I always wanted and the strong leader this real estate company actually needs to move into the future. And what exactly are you? You are a completely failed student wearing a cheap dress, holding a worthless empty briefcase, trying desperately to extort the very people who gave you life and put food on your plate." Vivica finally turned her head to look at me. Her dark eyes narrowed into angry, hateful slits. "Just sign the damn paper, Sydney." My mother snapped, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You are completely ruining our beautiful anniversary gala by even breathing the same air as our important, wealthy guests. Take the money and leave Atlanta tonight. We do not ever want to see your face again. You are absolutely dead to us from this moment forward, and this check is the last piece of charity you will ever receive from this family." I looked down at the massive, certified check and the thick, intimidating legal contract. I could physically feel the intense, heavy pressure in the room pressing down on my shoulders. The 3 corporate lawyers were staring at me, waiting like vultures for me to break under the immense stress. My parents were glaring at me with pure, unfiltered hatred, treating me worse than a complete stranger. Jasmine was shifting nervously from foot to foot, completely terrified, but desperately hoping I would just take the huge bribe and run away so she could go back to her fake, luxurious life. And Spencer was standing there looking incredibly smug, completely convinced that his master plan had worked flawlessly and that he had successfully bought my permanent silence. They all truly believed that $500,000 was enough to buy my entire soul. They thought my existence and my integrity could be priced and purchased like a piece of cheap commercial real estate. But they did not know that the $500,000 sitting on the table had been illegally transferred from a phantom commercial roofing budget just 2 days ago. They did not know that every single person in this room, except for me, was about to lose absolutely everything they valued in the world. I reached out slowly and gently picked up the certified check, holding the crisp paper between my fingers. I inspected the signature line, where Spencer had boldly signed his name as the chief financial officer. I looked back up at my arrogant brother-in-law and let a slow, cold, completely fearless smile form on my face. I reached across the polished mahogany table and wrapped my fingers around the expensive gold pen lying right next to the thick stack of legal documents. The metal felt cold and heavy in my hand. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. The 3 corporate lawyers leaned back in their leather chairs, looking completely satisfied with their easy victory. My mother, Vivica, let out a soft huff of air, relaxing her rigid posture slightly as she watched me bring the tip of the pen closer to the signature line on the final page of the contract. My father, DeAndre, simply crossed his arms, a smug look of absolute triumph settling over his features. He truly thought he had just successfully bullied me into submission. Spencer was practically vibrating with arrogant joy, standing by the heavy wooden doors, with his hands tucked casually into his tuxedo pockets. He exchanged a quick, victorious glance with Jasmine, thinking his massive web of lies was finally completely secure. I held the pen hovering just a fraction of an inch above the crisp white paper. I let the absolute silence stretch out for a few more agonizing seconds, letting them truly savor the sweet, false taste of their victory. I wanted them to feel completely safe and entirely in control before I ripped the floor right out from under them. Then, without breaking eye contact with Spencer, I slowly moved my hand away from the paper. I placed the gold pen gently back onto the polished mahogany table, letting it roll slightly until it clicked softly against my black briefcase. The sudden shift in the room was completely instantaneous. The smug, triumphant look on my father's face instantly transformed back into a dark, furious scowl. "What exactly are you doing?" Sidney DeAndre barked, leaning aggressively over the table. "Pick up the pen and sign the damn paper right now, or I will have security throw you out into the street." I completely ignored my father's empty threats and kept my eyes entirely locked onto my brother-in-law. $500,000 is a very generous offer, Spencer, I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady, echoing clearly in the quiet executive suite. But I am just a little bit curious about the actual accounting logistics behind this massive certified check. You see, the primary corporate operating account only had about $200,000 in liquid cash as of yesterday morning. So, where exactly did this sudden $500,000 come from? Spencer swallowed hard, his arrogant smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before he forced it back onto his pale face. "It came from an emergency reserve fund." He answered, his voice sounding slightly thinner than before. "It is internal corporate business that no longer concerns you, Sidney. Just sign the contract and take the money." I tilted my head slightly, letting out a soft, humorless laugh. "An emergency reserve fund?" I repeated slowly, testing the words on my tongue. "That is a very creative name for the downtown plaza commercial roofing budget." The three corporate lawyers suddenly sat up perfectly straight, exchanging highly confused and worried glances. My father frowned deeply, looking back and forth between me and Spencer. "What are you talking about, Sidney?" my father demanded, his voice losing some of its aggressive edge and replacing it with genuine confusion. "The downtown plaza roofing budget is strictly allocated for construction materials." "Is it really?" I asked casually, taking a small step away from the table and turning my full attention to my father. "Because according to the corporate ledgers, this check was authorized using a fake vendor invoice processed through a Delaware shell company called Apex Holdings. Routing number 4920177. The money was moved from the local Atlanta bank into the Delaware account at exactly 3:15 yesterday afternoon." The color completely drained from Spencer's face. His hands slipped out of his tuxedo pockets and fell limply to his sides. His jaw dropped slightly open as he stared at me in pure, unadulterated horror. Jasmine let out a sharp, terrified gasp and covered her mouth with both of her hands, backing away until she hit the heavy wooden door. "But the money does not usually stop in Delaware." "Does it, Spencer?" I continued, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous cadence. "Usually it gets wired directly to a Cayman Island holding account under the name Horizon Offshore Investments. Routing number 8821004. And from there, it gets quietly dispersed into 5 different private family trusts located in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Trusts that are entirely owned and operated by your bankrupt parents and your brothers." The executive suite descended into a suffocating, absolute silence. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, but it sounded like a roaring engine compared to the complete stillness of the people in the room. My father looked at Spencer, waiting for him to yell at me, waiting for him to aggressively deny the insane accusations. But Spencer could not speak. A thick layer of cold sweat broke out across his pale forehead, shining brightly under the warm, recessed lighting. His chest, he heaved rapidly as he struggled to pull air into his completely panicked lungs. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just violently snapped shut over his leg. "DeAndre, tell her to shut up!" Spencer finally choked out his voice, cracking pathetically into a high-pitched, frantic whisper. "She is lying. She is just making up numbers to confuse us." I reached over and popped the silver latches on my sleek black briefcase. The loud click echoed sharply in the quiet room, making Spencer violently flinch. "I am not making up anything." "Spencer," I said, pulling the thick black leather portfolio out of the briefcase and dropping it heavily onto the mahogany table right on top of the non-disclosure agreement. "I have every single wire transfer receipt, every single deleted email and crystal clear video footage of you and Jasmine forging the construction invoices in her top floor office. You have stolen over $15 million from this company in the past 3 years. This empire is completely bankrupt, and you are the one holding the bloody knife. Vivica let out a low, horrified moan, pressing her hand against her chest as she stared at the heavy leather portfolio. The corporate lawyers were completely paralyzed, staring at the thick binder of federal evidence with wide, terrified eyes. They knew instantly that this was not a desperate bluff. The level of specific financial detail I had just effortlessly rattled off was completely impossible to fabricate. My father slowly turned his head to look at his golden son-in-law. The absolute worship and deep respect he had always held for Spencer was rapidly melting away, revealing a dark, bottomless pit of realization and absolute rage. Spencer took a shaking step forward, raising his trembling hands in a desperate, completely pathetic gesture of surrender. "DeAndre, please, you have to listen to me," he begged, his voice breaking completely. "I can explain everything. It was just a temporary loan. I was going to put all the money back. I swear it." But his pathetic lies were completely useless now. The immaculate, perfect facade of the arrogant white savior had completely shattered into a million tiny, unfixable pieces right in front of the very people who had worshipped him. Spencer lunged forward toward the mahogany table, his desperate panic taking over his logical brain completely. He reached out with his shaking, sweating hands, desperately trying to grab the black leather portfolio to tear the federal evidence apart. His fingers scraped against the polished wood of the mahogany table as he made a pathetic, desperate sound in the back of his throat. He was acting like a cornered animal, realizing there was absolutely no escape. His eyes were wide and completely wild, fixed entirely on the black leather portfolio. I did not even flinch. I simply placed my hand firmly on top of the federal evidence, holding it down. Before his sweating fingers could even brush the edge of the binder, a loud, explosive crash echoed through the quiet executive suite. The heavy wooden double doors at the end of the room did not just open, they were violently thrown apart. The two massive private security guards who had been standing outside were forcefully shoved into the room, stumbling clumsily over the thick red carpet. Surging in right behind them was a highly trained tactical team of armed federal agents wearing dark vests with the letters FFSB printed in bright yellow across their chests. The quiet, tense atmosphere of the VIP room was instantly shattered by the deafening sound of heavy combat boots hitting the floor and federal agents shouting clear, authoritative commands. "Nobody move! Federal agents!" "Stay exactly where you are," a loud, booming voice commanded, cutting through the heavy air like a sharp knife. Director Mitchell stepped through the shattered doorway, looking incredibly imposing in his dark suit and federal badge flashing brightly under the recessed lighting. He was flanked by 4 heavily armed agents who immediately fanned out across the room, securing all the exits and physically blocking anyone from making a sudden run for it. The radios on their shoulders buzzed with harsh static, reporting that the perimeter of the luxury hotel was fully secured. Spencer froze mid-lunge, his arms still stretched awkwardly across the mahogany table. The remaining color in his face completely vanished, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. He stopped breathing entirely. The 3 expensive corporate lawyers instantly threw their hands up into the air, terrified of making any sudden movements that might provoke the armed tactical team. They backed away from the table, dropping their expensive gold pens and desperately trying to look as harmless as possible. My mother Vivica let out a piercing, completely hysterical scream and grabbed onto my father's arm, her long manicured fingernails digging sharply into his tuxedo jacket. DeAndre stood up from his chair, his chest puffed out in a completely foolish attempt to maintain his authority in a room he no longer controlled. His face was flushed purple with outrage, completely unable to comprehend that his precious world was being invaded. "What is the meaning of this?" DeAndre shouted, his voice trembling with a mixture of intense fear and blind arrogance. "I am the founder of this company, and this is a private executive suite. You cannot just barge in here without a warrant. Do you have any idea who I know?" In this city, I will have your badges for this completely disrespectful intrusion. Director Mitchell did not even blink at my father's pathetic, empty threats. He walked calmly past the terrified corporate lawyers and stopped directly in front of the table. He pulled a thick stack of folded legal documents from his inner jacket pocket and slapped them down right next to the fraudulent $500,000 check. "I know exactly who you are," Mitchell said, his voice cold and completely uncompromising. "And I am holding a federal warrant signed by a United States judge authorizing the immediate and total freeze of every single corporate and personal asset tied to your real estate empire. Your bank accounts, your commercial properties, your family trusts, and your offshore shell companies are officially locked as of 3 minutes ago." My father collapsed back into his heavy leather chair as if he had just been physically shot in the chest. All the arrogant fight completely left his body, leaving him looking like a small, broken old man. He stared at the federal document in absolute shock, his mouth opening and closing silently. Vivica began to hyperventilate, clutching her heavy gold necklace as if the federal agents were about to rip it right off her neck. She looked wildly around the room for a way out that simply did not exist, her eyes wide with total, unadulterated panic. Mitchell turned his sharp professional gaze away from my ruined father and locked his eyes directly onto Spencer, who was still completely frozen over the table. "Spencer, you are under federal arrest for massive wire fraud, international money laundering, corporate embezzlement, and witness tampering," Mitchell announced, reading the severe charges with a practiced, terrifying calmness. Two federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing Spencer's arms and violently yanking him back away from the mahogany table. The sudden, rough physical contact finally snapped Spencer out of his terrified paralysis. He began to thrash wildly against the highly trained agents, his expensive tuxedo jacket ripping slightly at the shoulder seam. "No, wait! You do not understand!" he screamed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail. "I did not do it alone. You have to look at the other executives. I was just following orders. You have the wrong guy. I can give you names. I can cooperate. Just please do not put me in handcuffs." He was crying, real tears now, completely abandoning his fake stoic persona and begging desperately for his pathetic life. He even tried to point a shaking finger at my father, hoping to throw the man who gave him everything directly under the bus, just to save himself. The agents ignored his completely useless pleading. They forcefully spun him around, slamming him chest first against the wall, and snapping heavy steel handcuffs securely around his trembling wrists. The loud metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply in the room, cementing his absolute doom. Jasmine let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob. She pushed herself off the wall and tried to run toward her husband, her expensive diamond necklace swinging wildly around her neck. "Spencer!" she cried, reaching her hands out toward him as the agents dragged him back to his feet. But a female federal agent immediately stepped into her path, placing a firm hand on Jasmine's chest and pushing her back against the wall. "Do not take another step, Mom," the agent warned sharply, her hand resting dangerously close to her tactical belt. "What are you doing to him?" Jasmine shrieked, tears completely ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. "He is a good man. He is the chief financial officer of this company. You are making a massive mistake. You cannot take him away from me." Mitchell turned to look at my hysterical sister, his expression completely flat. "The only mistake made here was assuming the federal government does not know how to trace a Delaware wire transfer," Mitchell said coldly, looking right at the massive diamond ring on her trembling finger. "Your husband has stolen over $15 million, and he is going to spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary thinking about it." The 3 corporate lawyers were frantically packing their briefcases, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive explosion that had just decimated their wealthiest client. One of them tried to quietly slip out the side door, but an agent immediately blocked his path, informing him that everyone in the room was currently being detained for federal questioning. The sheer chaos in the executive suite was absolutely beautiful to watch. The loud, joyful jazz music from the anniversary gala was still faintly playing in the background, completely contrasting with the total destruction happening inside this room. My parents. Empire. The glittering 30-year legacy they had built and protected with such ruthless toxicity was crumbling to the floor right in front of their eyes. The trap had worked flawlessly. Jasmine could not reach her husband through the wall of armed federal agents, so she spun around and locked her furious, tear-filled eyes directly onto me. Her sorrow instantly morphed into pure, unadulterated venom. She pointed a shaking finger at my face, her diamond bracelet catching the harsh light of the room. "This is all your fault, Sydney!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You called the FBI because you could not stand seeing us happy and successful. You lied to them. You made up these ridiculous numbers because you are a jealous, bitter dropout who has absolutely nothing." My mother Vivica joined in her panic, turning into desperate anger. "How could you do this to your own family?" Vivica shrieked, clutching her chest. "You are destroying your father's 30-year anniversary over some petty childhood jealousy. Tell these agents you made it all up, Sydney. Tell them right now before they ruin our public image completely." They actually believed I was just a vindictive civilian who had somehow managed to trick the federal government into raiding a corporate gala. They thought I was still the powerless scapegoat they could bully into submission. I did not say a word at first. I simply picked up my sleek black briefcase and calmly snapped the silver latches shut, locking the federal evidence safely inside. Then I reached into the inner lining of my black evening gown. My fingers wrapped around the smooth leather of my official credentials. I pulled the black leather wallet out and held it up right in front of Jasmine's screaming face. With a quick flick of my wrist, I flipped the wallet open. The heavy gold shield of the Federal Financial Security Bureau caught the bright recessed lighting, reflecting a brilliant blinding flash of federal authority right into her eyes. Jasmine's mouth clamped shut so fast her teeth clicked together. She stared at the gleaming gold badge and the federal identification card that bore my photograph and my official title. The room plunged back into absolute silence, save for the heavy breathing of my brother-in-law, who was still pressed against the wall in steel handcuffs. "I am not a jealous dropout, Jasmine," I said, my voice perfectly level and echoing with cold, absolute authority. "My name is Special Agent Sydney, and I am the lead forensic investigator for the Federal Financial Security Bureau. I did not just call the FBI, I personally orchestrated this entire sting operation from the very beginning. I was the one who tracked your stolen millions to the Cayman Islands, and I was the one who drafted the arrest warrants your husband is currently wearing." The physical reaction from my family was incredible to witness. My father, DeAndre, physically recoiled, as if the gold badge emitting from my hand was a glowing hot iron. His eyes darted frantically from the badge to my face, and then over to Director Mitchell, looking for someone to tell him this was all a terrible practical joke. But Mitchell simply nodded, crossing his heavy arms over his chest. "She is one of the most brilliant federal investigators we have," Mitchell stated coldly, completely shattering my father's desperate denial. "She built the entire federal case against your company single-handedly while you were busy trying to starve her out on the streets." The absolute shock paralyzed my mother completely. The daughter she had mocked just a few days ago at the luxury mall, the daughter she called a low-level bank teller, was standing in front of her, wielding the absolute highest level of federal power. Vivica looked at my expensive black evening gown and finally realized it was not a desperate attempt to fit in, but a calculated armor worn by a hunter who had already cornered her prey. "You downloaded the servers," Spencer whispered from the wall, his voice sounding like a hollow, broken wheeze. "The night you left, you took everything." I turned to look at my ruined brother-in-law, offering him a slow, cold smile. "That is right, Spencer," I replied, walking slowly toward him. "While you and Jasmine were upstairs laughing about cutting off my tuition, I was in my bedroom bypassing your pathetic security firewalls. You thought freezing my bank accounts would force me to surrender, but all it did was give me the absolute freedom and the relentless motivation to completely dismantle your entire life." Jasmine suddenly realized the massive, inescapable gravity of her situation. The federal agent standing in front of her was not a stranger she could manipulate or a sister she could bully. It was the woman she had mercilessly tormented for 24 years. Jasmine's arrogant anger completely evaporated, leaving only raw, pathetic terror. "Sydney, please," Jasmine begged, dropping to her knees on the thick red carpet regardless of her expensive designer dress. "I did not know what Spencer was doing. I swear to you, I was just signing the papers he gave me. You have to believe me. I am your sister." I looked down at her crying on the floor, feeling absolutely no pity or familial connection. "Do not insult my intelligence, Jasmine," I said coldly, looking down at her perfect fake tears. "I have crystal clear audio recordings of you specifically demanding stolen pension funds just so you could buy that exact diamond necklace you are wearing right now. I watched the high-definition security footage of you laughing about bankrupting this company and leaving our parents with absolutely nothing. You are not a victim, Jasmine. You are a willing co-conspirator, and your federal arrest warrant is currently sitting right inside my briefcase." The sound that came out of my father's mouth was a cross between a dry heave and a sob. He looked at Jasmine, his golden child, his perfect, beautiful daughter, who could do absolutely no wrong. The horrible, crushing reality finally hit him with the force of a speeding train. His perfect white son-in-law and his precious golden daughter had actively conspired to completely destroy his 30-year legacy, while his discarded scapegoat daughter was the only one who possessed the moral integrity to uncover the truth. DeAndre covered his face with his trembling hands, completely unable to bear the heavy weight of his own colossal failures. The empire was dead, and the golden child was a federal criminal. The federal agents moved in closer, pulling Jasmine up from the floor by her arms. She screamed and kicked, thrashing wildly against their strong grips, but it was completely useless. She was dragged over to the wall right next to her completely broken husband and forced to face the harsh reality of cold steel handcuffs snapping tightly around her own wrists. She looked at my parents, screaming for them to do something, to call a lawyer, to use their influence to stop this. But DeAndre and Vivica just stood there, completely broken and entirely powerless. Their massive wealth and their high society connections were absolutely useless against the crushing weight of federal justice. The scapegoat they had thrown to the wolves had returned, leading the entire pack. I stood in the center of the devastated room, watching the federal agents read Jasmine her rights. Her shrill voice echoed in the suite, a sharp contrast to the confident, arrogant tone she had used just 10 minutes ago when she thought I was signing my life away. The three corporate lawyers were huddled in the corner, completely silent, terrified that I might point a finger at them next and implicate them in the massive cover-up. They knew my badge gave me the authority to tear through their own law firm with federal subpoenas if I even suspected they knew about the offshore accounts. My mother Vivica slowly slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor right next to the mahogany table. Her sparkling emerald dress pooled around her in a sad, pathetic pile. She looked up at me with tears completely ruining her expensive makeup. "Sydney," she whispered, her voice cracking with a desperate sorrow she had never once shown me during my childhood. "You could have told us, you could have come to us privately, and we could have fixed this without the federal government tearing our family apart." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had watched her husband strip away my education and throw me out into the cold without shedding a single tear. "I did come to you privately," I reminded her, my voice devoid of any warmth. "6 months ago, I brought you the internal server logs. I tried to save this family empire. But you chose to believe a white parasite and a spoiled liar simply because they fit your perfect country club image better than your own analytical daughter. You made your choice, Vivica, and now you are sitting in the ashes of the fire you helped them start." Director Mitchell watched my mother weeping on the floor for a brief moment before he reached into his dark jacket and pulled out a second thick document. It was a massive printed copy of the complete financial forensic report I had compiled over the last 6 months. Mitchell tossed it effortlessly onto the polished mahogany table. The heavy binder landed right next to the fraudulent $500,000 check with a loud, definitive thud. "Read it," DeAndre Mitchell commanded, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. Read exactly how your golden son-in-law and your perfect daughter dismantled your entire 30-year legacy while you were busy trying to impress your wealthy friends. My father, DeAndre, slowly reached out with hands that were shaking so violently he could barely grip the thick cardboard cover. He flipped the binder open. The very first page was a comprehensive flowchart I had designed to track the stolen money. It showed the massive commercial development accounts, the very lifeblood of his real estate empire, bleeding directly into the Delaware shell companies. DeAndre traced the black lines with a trembling finger, his eyes widening as he saw the exact dates and the massive offshore wire transfers. He flipped to the next page and saw the high-definition screenshots of the forged vendor invoices, all bearing Jasmine's unmistakable, elegant signature. But the final crushing blow came when DeAndre turned to the third section of the report. There, printed in stark black and white, were the final destination routing numbers of his stolen millions. He read the names of the private family trusts registered in Connecticut and Massachusetts. He read the names of Spencer's bankrupt parents and his elite white family members. My father realized in that exact agonizing moment that he had not just been robbed, he had been completely used and humiliated. He had sacrificed his own brilliant black daughter to protect a white man who was secretly siphoning his black wealth to save a decaying old money family that probably laughed at DeAndre behind closed doors. The empire he had built from the dirt of Atlanta, the legacy he had sacrificed his entire life to construct, was totally gone. The corporate bank accounts were completely empty, and the massive federal fines would seize whatever physical properties were left. A guttural, completely broken sound escaped my father's throat. It was a sound of pure, total devastation. He dropped the heavy report onto the table and buried his face in his hands, weeping openly in front of the federal agents and the terrified corporate lawyers. The powerful, untouchable real estate king of Atlanta was reduced to a sobbing, broken man in a matter of minutes. He had lost absolutely everything because his blind, arrogant favoritism had allowed a parasite to completely consume his life. Seeing my father completely collapse finally broke whatever fragile denial my mother was still holding on to. Vivica let out a sharp, desperate cry and physically crawled across the thick red carpet. She ignored the armed federal agents and dragged her expensive emerald dress across the floor until she reached my feet. She grabbed the hem of my black evening gown, looking up at me with a face completely stained by ruined makeup and absolute terror. "Sydney, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic hoarse whisper. "You work for them, Sydney. You are a federal agent. You have the power to stop this. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you found new evidence that clears your sister and your father. We can give the money back. We can sell the houses and pay the government whatever they want. Just please do not let them take Jasmine to prison. She is your sister, Sydney. She is my baby. You have to fix this." I looked down at my mother kneeling on the floor in her expensive jewelry, begging me to illegally abuse my federal authority just to save the golden child who had actively destroyed them. The absolute audacity of her request was genuinely staggering. Even now, completely surrounded by the catastrophic ruins of their own making, Vivica still believed that I existed solely to serve and protect them. She still expected the discarded scapegoat to somehow miraculously clean up the massive toxic mess they had created. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my dress out of her desperate grip and took a deliberate step back away from her. "I am not your fixer, Vivica," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "And I am certainly not going to risk my federal career and my freedom to save a woman who laughed about stealing your pension funds." Vivica let out a loud, sobbing gasp, reaching her hands out toward me again. But I simply looked down at her with complete emptiness. "You asked me how I could do this to my own family," I continued, looking from my weeping mother to my broken father, and finally to Jasmine, who was standing against the wall in steel handcuffs, crying uncontrollably. "But you seem to forget the night you completely erased me from this family. You sat at a massive dining table and told me I was a disgrace. You cut off my tuition, you froze my bank accounts, and you tried to starve me out onto the streets just because I dared to tell you the truth about your precious son-in-law. You told me to pack my bags and leave your house. You told me I was absolutely dead to you. I paused, letting my cold words sink deeply into their panicked minds. You wanted me out of your perfect fake life so badly, I said softly. Well, you finally got exactly what you wanted. I am completely gone, and everything that is happening in this room right now is just the bill arriving for the choices you made. I turned away from my kneeling mother and picked up my empty black briefcase from the mahogany table. The federal agents were already moving forward, taking complete control of the executive suite. Director Mitchell gave me a short, professional nod, a silent confirmation that my part in this operation was officially over. The trap had been sprung, the evidence was delivered, and the federal justice system was now in total, absolute control. I did not say goodbye. I simply turned my back on the chaotic ruins of my toxic family and walked toward the heavy wooden double doors. The sound of my stiletto heels clicked sharply against the floor, completely drowning out Jasmine's desperate screaming and my mother's pathetic sobbing. I walked out of the VIP room, leaving the stench of fear and old leather behind me, and stepped back into the long, quiet corridor. I walked down the grand staircase and re-entered the massive luxury ballroom. The atmosphere of the 30-year anniversary gala had completely changed. The live jazz band had stopped playing, and the wealthy socialites were whispering frantically to each other, holding their cell phones and pointing toward the massive front doors. Unmarked federal vehicles with flashing blue and red lights had completely surrounded the luxury hotel. Heavily armed federal agents were standing at every exit, securing the building to ensure no corporate documents were removed from the premises. The elite members of the affluent black church, the very people who had read Jasmine's fake Facebook post and condemned me as a mentally unstable thief, now stared at me in total fearful awe as I walked calmly through the center of the panicked crowd. They saw the federal badge clipped to my belt, and they quickly parted like the Red Sea, completely terrified to even make eye contact with me. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the hotel and stepped out into the warm, humid Atlanta night. The air tasted incredibly sweet and fresh. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations that had crushed my chest for 24 years was completely gone. I took a deep, cleansing breath, looking up at the bright city lights reflecting against the dark clouds. A sleek black federal SUV was idling quietly by the curb, just past the velvet ropes and the flashing police lights. The passenger window rolled down, revealing Director Mitchell sitting behind the wheel. He had slipped out the back exit while his tactical team secured the prisoners. He looked at me and offered a rare, genuine smile of total respect. "You did excellent work today," Special Agent Mitchell said, his deep voice carrying over the noise of the chaotic street. "Are you ready to go home?" I opened the heavy door of the SUV and climbed into the comfortable leather passenger seat, placing my briefcase gently on the floor. "Yes, Director," I replied softly, looking out the window as the massive luxury hotel faded into the distance. "I am finally ready." The black SUV pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the busy downtown traffic, leaving the shattered remnants of the real estate empire far behind in the rearview mirror. My parents were going to lose their massive mansion, their luxury cars, and their prestigious social standing. Spencer and Jasmine were going to face decades in federal prison for their massive financial crimes. They had tried to bury me in the dark, but they did not realize I was a seed, and the pressure they applied only forced me to grow into something completely unbreakable. My name is Sydney, and this is the story of how I used my mind to completely dismantle the toxic family that tried to destroy me. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, if you have ever been pushed aside for a golden child who took everything for granted, I want you to know that your quiet strength is your greatest weapon. Never let them dim your light, and never be afraid to walk away from the people who refuse to see your true value. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of surviving toxic families. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to completely flip the board.